You probably know Canada for its mountains, its maple syrup, and its long, quiet winters. But there is another side of this country, one built on booms that turned to busts almost overnight. Somewhere north of every highway you have ever driven, there are streets with no houses left standing on them, company towns that were bulldozed on purpose, and a mining camp that was buried alive by half a mountain while people slept. In this video, we are counting down 20 Canadian ghost towns left behind by history. Places where the mines closed, the mills went quiet, and the muskeg and the spruce forest crept back in. So stay with me to the end, because number one is a town that vanished in under 2 minutes, and it is still one of the deadliest disasters this country has ever seen. So hit subscribe, and let's begin. Number 20, Bankhead, Alberta. If you walk a quiet, interpretive trail inside Banff National Park today, past ski hills and tour buses full of visitors, you eventually come to a clearing full of crumbling concrete. Foundations sit half buried in wildflowers. A mine portal stares out from the hillside, boarded and silent. This was once Bankhead, a coal town built by the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1904 to fuel its steam locomotives. At its peak, it had 1,000 residents, a school, a hospital, and rows of company houses along the base of Cascade Mountain. But the coal at Bankhead was hard to mine and expensive to process, and by the early 1920s, the CPR decided it was not worth the trouble. The mine closed in 1922. Entire houses were loaded onto flatbed trucks and hauled off to Banff and Calgary. What could not be moved was left to fall apart. Today, hikers walk past the old power plant ruins without always knowing what they are looking at. Bankhead is a reminder that even inside one of Canada's most visited national parks, an entire town can disappear and barely leave a footprint. Number 19, Phoenix, British Columbia. High in the boundary country of southern British Columbia sits a golf course and a war memorial, standing almost alone on a windswept summit. It is hard to imagine that this exact spot was once the highest incorporated city in Canada. Phoenix boomed in the 1900s on some of the richest copper ore in the province, and at its height, it held more than 4,000 people, complete with an opera house, a hockey rink, and its own daily newspaper. But copper prices are unforgiving. When demand collapsed at the end of the First World War, the Granby Mining Company shut its smelter and pulled out almost overnight. Homes were abandoned mid-meal. Businesses were locked and never reopened. And by 1920, the town that once claimed to be the highest city in the British Empire was completely empty. The buildings were dismantled for scrap, and the mountain itself was eventually strip-mined away. Today, only the cemetery and a lone stone cenotaph remain, standing watch over a town site that technically no longer has a mountain under it. Number 18, Sandon, British Columbia. Deep in the Selkirk Mountains, a narrow valley holds the crumbling remains of what was once called the silver capital of Canada. In the 1890s, Sandon had thousands of prospectors, dozens of hotels, and its own electric streetcar line, all crammed into a gulch barely wide enough for one street. For a while, it looked like Sandon would last forever, fed by some of the richest silver lead veins ever found in British Columbia. But fire tore through the wooden town site in 1900, and although it was rebuilt, silver prices never fully recovered. Miners drifted away for decades, and then in 1955, a flood swept through the narrow valley and destroyed most of what remained. Today, a handful of leaning wooden buildings still stand along the creek, propped up by volunteers, while pine trees grow straight through the floorboards of the old assay office. It is a quiet, tilted museum to a boom that briefly rivaled any city in the province. Number 17, Silver Islet, Ontario. Off the tip of the Sibley Peninsula on Lake Superior, there is a rocky islet barely bigger than a city block. If you paddle out to it on a calm day, it is hard to believe that this speck of rock once held one of the richest silver mines in North America. Discovered in 1868, the Silver Islet mine forced workers to dig shafts straight down beneath the lake itself, racing to keep ahead of the water pressing in from every side. For over a decade, the mine produced staggering amounts of silver, and a small town grew up on the mainland shore to support it. But in the winter of 1884, a coal shipment meant to keep the pumps running never arrived before the lake froze over. Water flooded the shafts, and the mine was lost for good. Today, the islet itself is protected by a concrete breakwater built to keep the waves from finishing what the flood started. and the old miners' cottages on shore have become a quiet summer cottage community, sitting directly above one of the richest and shortest-lived mines in Canadian history. Number 16. Depot Harbour, Ontario. On Perry Island in Georgian Bay, cracked roads run through second-growth forest, leading nowhere in particular. Grand foundations poke through the undergrowth near the shoreline. This was once Depot Harbour, a railway port built in 1897 by lumber baron J.R. Booth to ship grain and timber straight from the prairies to the Great Lakes. At its peak, Depot Harbour had 3,000 residents, massive grain elevators, and a harbour busier than nearby Perry Sound. But the Panama Canal opened new shipping routes in 1914, and freight slowly drained away from the port. Then, in 1945, a fire tore through the remaining grain elevators and warehouses, destroying what industry had left behind. The town was never rebuilt. Depot Harbour sits on Wasauksing First Nation land today, and the forest has folded back over the old rail yard so completely that most visitors driving through would never guess a bustling port once stood there. Number 15. Britannia Beach, British Columbia. If you drive the sea-to-sky highway between Vancouver and Whistler, you pass an enormous concrete mill building clinging to the mountainside above Howe Sound. For decades, Britannia Beach was home to one of the largest copper mines in the British Empire, drawing workers from more than 50 countries to its steep, terraced town site. Homes, a hospital, and churches were built directly into the mountain slope, since there was almost no flat ground to spare. The mine produced copper for more than 70 years, through 2 world wars and a long, slow decline in ore quality. When it finally closed in 1974, most of the town emptied out within a few years, leaving behind rusting machinery and empty staff housing. Unlike so many places on this list, Britannia Beach was not left to rot. Today, the old concentrator mill has been preserved as a National Historic Site and Museum. One of the few Canadian mining towns where the ghosts are given a proper welcome and a gift shop. Number 14. Bralorne, British Columbia. Tucked deep in the Coast Mountains, reachable only by a long, winding logging road, sits what remains of one of Canada's richest gold camps. Bralorne and its sister town Pioneer once held over 4,000 people between them, with theaters, curling rinks, and enough gold coming out of the ground to make it one of the top producing mines in the entire British Commonwealth. For decades it seemed unstoppable, but rising costs and falling gold prices caught up with the operation, and the mine finally shut down in 1971. Businesses closed, the school lost its students, and most of Pioneer was quietly dismantled and hauled away. Bralorne itself avoided complete abandonment, and a small community of a few dozen people still lives among its wooden company houses today, keeping the lights on in what is otherwise one of the most remote surviving mining towns in British Columbia. Number 13. Keno City in Elsa, Yukon. Along the Silver Trail in central Yukon, gravel roads wind past tailings piles and empty bunkhouses under an enormous sky. Keno City and the nearby company town of Elsa once anchored one of the richest silver mining districts on Earth, feeding smelters as far away as Trail, British Columbia, for most of the 20th century. Elsa in particular was a true company town, with United Keno Hill Mines controlling every house, store, and job in the community. But silver prices are volatile, and by the 1980s the mine was struggling through repeated shutdowns and reopenings. A final closure came in 1989, and Elsa was essentially emptied within a few years, its houses standing locked and silent along the hillside. Keno City survives today as a tiny outpost of a few dozen residents. Its old mining museum sitting beneath a sign-covered hilltop where miners once nailed hand-painted markers pointing toward their hometowns, thousands of kilometers away. And hey, before we move on to our next forgotten Canadian ghost town, I hope you're enjoying this journey so far. It would mean a lot if you hit that like button, since it really helps this kind of history reach more people. Alright, back to the countdown. Number 12. Ocean Falls, British Columbia. On the central coast of British Columbia, where rain falls almost every day of the year, a massive concrete dam still holds back a reservoir above an almost empty town site. Ocean Falls was built around a pulp and paper mill in the early 1900s, and by the middle of the century it was a thriving company town of more than 3,000 people, complete with a heated indoor swimming pool that produced Olympic swimmers. The mill ran for decades, but rising costs and an aging plant eventually made it unprofitable, and Crown Zellerbach shut it down for good in 1980. Almost the entire population left within a matter of months, and the company town's furniture, appliances, and personal belongings were simply left behind in the rush. Today, fewer than 100 people remain in Ocean Falls, living among crumbling apartment blocks and a dam that still generates far more power than the tiny community could ever use. Number 11. Uranium City, Saskatchewan. On the remote northern shore of Lake Athabasca, roads lead to intersections with no buildings left standing at the corners. Uranium City grew explosively in the 1950s after El Dorado Mining discovered rich uranium deposits nearby, feeding Cold War demand for nuclear material. At its peak, the town held more than 5,000 people, along with a hospital, a curling rink, and its own airport. For a while, it looked like Uranium City would last forever, propped up by a government eager for uranium at almost any cost. But in 1982, El Dorado abruptly announced it was closing its mine, and the town's population collapsed within 18 months, dropping from thousands to a few hundred almost overnight. Streets that once needed traffic lights now sit empty between overgrown foundations. Today, fewer than 100 people remain in Uranium City, and the old high school still stands, its hallways silent under the aurora that flickers over Lake Athabasca each winter. Number 10. Cassiar, British Columbia. In the far north of British Columbia, near the Yukon border, a gravel turnoff leads into a valley that used to hold one of the world's largest asbestos mines. Cassiar was built in the 1950s to house the workers of that mine, eventually growing into a tidy company town of around 1,500 people, complete with a hockey arena and a modern high school. For decades, the mine was profitable, feeding a global demand for asbestos that seemed like it would never slow down. But that demand eventually did slow down, as health concerns and falling prices caught up with the industry through the 1980s. In 1992, the mining company declared bankruptcy, and Cassiar was abandoned within months. What happened next was unusual. Rather than leaving the buildings to rot, the entire town site was auctioned off piece by piece, and many of its houses were physically trucked away to nearby communities. Cassiar was not just abandoned. It was sold off, one building at a time, until almost nothing remained but empty streets. Number 9. Aniak's, British Columbia. Along a remote fjord on the northwest coast of British Columbia, accessible only by boat or float plane, thick rainforest has folded itself around the ruins of what was once one of Canada's largest copper smelters. Aniak's was built in 1914 by the Granby Consolidated Mining Company, and it grew rapidly into a town of over 3,000 people, powered by its own hydroelectric dam and connected to the outside world only by steamship. For 20 years, the smelter ran around the clock, its smokestacks visible for kilometers along the coast. But falling copper prices during the Great Depression made the operation unprofitable, and Granby shut it down in 1935. Because Aniak's existed only to serve the smelter, the entire town was abandoned within weeks, its residents scattered along the coast in search of new work. Today, moss-covered concrete foundations and a rusting hydroelectric station sit half swallowed by temperate rainforest, one of the most completely reclaimed industrial sites in the country. Number 8. Beaujalbert, Quebec. Beside a set of thundering waterfalls near Lac Saint-Jean, rows of neat wooden houses stand in perfect, silent lines along a grid of empty streets. Beaujalbert was built in 1901 around a pulp mill that harnessed the power of the 72-meter Ouiachiwan Falls, and it was designed as a model company town, complete with electricity, running water, and sewer lines at a time when many Canadian cities still lacked them. For a while, business was excellent, driven by heavy demand for newsprint in Britain and the United States. But that demand fell sharply through the 1920s, and the mill finally shut its doors in 1927. Many workers stayed for another 2 years, hoping the mill would reopen, but it never did, and the last families left by 1929. Beaujalbert was left almost entirely intact by its emptiness, and in the 1960s, the Quebec government turned the site into a heritage park. Today, if you visit, you can still walk down Main Street past a general store, a school, and a church, all frozen at the exact moment the mill went quiet. Number 7. Battle Harbor, Newfoundland and Labrador. On a small island off the southeast coast of Labrador, wooden fishing stages and saltbox houses line a narrow, sheltered harbor. For nearly 2 centuries, Battle Harbor was known as the unofficial capital of Labrador, a bustling hub of the cod fishery where merchant ships loaded salted fish bound for markets across the Atlantic. But cod stocks declined through the 20th century, and in the 1960s, the Newfoundland government began an aggressive resettlement program, encouraging and sometimes pressuring residents of small outports to relocate to larger, more serviced communities. Families loaded their belongings, and in some cases their entire houses, onto barges and left Battle Harbor behind for good by 1966. The harbor sat quiet for decades, its fish stages slowly rotting in the salt air. Today, a nonprofit trust has restored much of the site as a living heritage community. But for most of the year, it remains what it has been since resettlement, a beautiful, empty harbor waiting for boats that mostly do not come anymore. Number 6. Grande Grève, Quebec. Along the rugged coast of the Gaspé Peninsula, inside what is now Fourrion National Park, a scatter of old fishing sheds and foundations sits among the spruce and birch. This was once Grande Grève, one of several small fishing communities that had lined this coast for generations, their families tied to the cod fishery and to land passed down for over a century. Everything changed in 1970, when the Quebec government decided to create a new national park along this stretch of coastline. Rather than working around the existing communities, the province expropriated the land outright, forcing more than 200 families out of homes some had lived in for 5 generations. Compensation was often minimal, and some families later described being given only weeks to leave. Houses that were not moved were bulldozed or burned by park authorities to prevent people from returning. Today, hiking trails wind past a handful of preserved buildings that tell the story of Fourrion's fishing families, but for the people who once lived there, the park was never entirely worth the town it replaced. Number 5. Pine Point, Northwest Territories. On the south shore of Great Slave Lake, a paved road runs for kilometers past cracked sidewalks and empty street corners, with not a single building left standing along its length. Pine Point was built in the 1960s around a massive lead zinc mine, and the federal government poured nearly $100 million into railways and hydro lines to support it, hoping to turn the north into an industrial frontier. At its peak, Pine Point held almost 2,000 residents, with a school, a hospital, and streets full of families who had signed on for what felt like a permanent new life in the north. But the ore body was never going to last forever, and falling metal prices sealed the mine's fate through the 1980s. The mine shut down in 1987, and the following year, something unusual happened. Rather than leaving the empty buildings behind, Cominco tore the entire town site down, worried that squatters might move in once the mine's owners walked away. Homes were trucked off to nearby communities, and everything else was flattened. Today, Pine Point is not simply abandoned, it is erased, a grid of empty pavement in the boreal forest, where 2,000 people once built a life that no longer has an address. Number 4. Quetzalt, British Columbia. At the head of a remote fjord in the Coast Mountains, past hours of gravel switchbacks, a locked gate opens onto rows of pristine, empty houses. Quetzalt does not look like a ghost town. The lawns are still mowed. The streetlights still turn on at dusk. But nobody has lived here since 1983, built in 1979 by the American mining company Amex to house workers for a molybdenum mine. Quetzalt was constructed almost overnight at a cost of over $50 million, complete with a shopping mall, a hospital, a bowling alley, and apartments for 1,200 residents. For a while, it looked like Quetzalt would last for 25 years. The length of time engineers had estimated the ore body would hold out, but molybdenum prices crashed within 18 months of the town opening, and in 1982, AMAC suspended operations for good. Families were given moving expenses and told to leave, and by late 1983, the last 2 residents locked the gates behind them. Unlike almost every other town on this list, Quetzalt was never demolished, and a series of private owners have spent decades maintaining it, mowing lawns and keeping the power running in a town nobody is allowed to live in anymore. Number 3. Gagnon, Quebec. Deep in the boreal wilderness of Quebec's Côte-Nord region, a stretch of Route 389 suddenly widens into a strange, ghostly boulevard, complete with a median, sidewalks, and storm drains, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town. This is all that remains of Gagnon, an iron mining community built in 1957 that once housed nearly 4,000 people, along with schools, a hospital, and a cinema, all flown in piece by piece, since no road connected it to the rest of Quebec. For decades, the mine was one of the richest iron operations in the province, but a global iron crisis in 1982 crushed profits. And by October 1984, residents were gathered into the basement of the local church and told their town would close within the year. What happened next set Gagnon apart from almost every other ghost town in this country. Rather than simply abandoning the buildings, the mining company demolished the entire town over the following 2 years, tearing down homes, churches, and the hospital until nothing remained but cracked pavement and an airstrip. Gagnon was not left to fade away. It was deliberately, systematically erased from the map, a town that Canada chose to unbuild rather than let stand empty. I hope you're enjoying this journey through Canada's forgotten places so far. If you have not already, now is a great time to subscribe and turn on notifications, because we have 2 more places left, and they might be the most haunting entries on this entire list. Number 2, Marachine and the resettled outports of Newfoundland. Scattered across the bays and coves of Newfoundland's south coast, there once stood hundreds of small fishing communities like Marachine, tiny outports accessible only by boat, where families had fished the same waters for generations. Marachine itself held several hundred residents at its peak, along with a church, a school, and a wharf lined with fishing stages. But after Newfoundland joined Confederation in 1949, the provincial government launched a series of resettlement programs designed to move residents of small, isolated outports into larger, centralized communities with roads, electricity, and modern services. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, more than 300 outports across the province were emptied, and Marachine was one of them, closed in 1963. In some of the most striking images in Canadian history, entire wooden houses were floated across the water on barges, towed to their new communities rather than left behind. For those willing to relocate, the government offered a small cash payment. But for many families, it also meant leaving behind churches, cemeteries, and a way of life tied directly to the sea. Today, Marachine sits empty, its foundations visible in the tall grass, one of hundreds of Newfoundland communities that Canada quietly voted out of existence. Number 1, Frank, Alberta. If you drive along Highway 3 through the Crow's Nest Pass in southern Alberta, you eventually pass an enormous field of house-sized limestone boulders stretching across the entire valley floor. It looks almost like a dry, gray glacier frozen mid-flow. This is the Frank Slide, and underneath those boulders lies part of a town that vanished in under 2 minutes. Frank was founded in 1901 as a coal town at the base of Turtle Mountain, and it grew quickly, reaching 600 residents by 1903, with a 2-story school, 4 hotels, and a mine that was shipping out coal by the trainload. The Blackfoot and Kutaxa peoples had long called Turtle Mountain. The Blackfoot and Kutaxa peoples had long called Turtle Mountain the Moves, and refused to camp near its base. Nobody in the new town knew that warning, or chose to believe it. At 4:10 in the morning on April 29, 1903, that warning proved true. Roughly 110 million tons of limestone broke away from the eastern face of Turtle Mountain and thundered down into the valley. Witnesses said it took only about 100 seconds for the rock to cross the valley floor, moving at speeds close to 112 kilometers an hour. In that time, it buried the eastern edge of Frank under rock as deep as 45 meters in places, destroying homes, the mine entrance, farms, and the town cemetery. Somewhere between 70 and 90 people died, and to this day only 18 bodies have ever been recovered. Astonishingly, many survivors chose to stay, and the town was partly rebuilt, its population briefly climbing past 1,000 within a few years. But in 1911, a royal commission determined that the remaining slope of Turtle Mountain was still unstable, and the surviving portion of Frank was ordered to relocate across the railway tracks for good. The mine eventually closed, and Frank was folded into the modern municipality of Crow's Nest Pass. Today, an interpretive center overlooks the debris field, and hiking trails wind between boulders the size of houses, above the unmarked graves of dozens of people who never had time to wake up. Geologists say the mountain that moves is not finished moving. Somewhere beneath those gray limestone blocks, an entire Canadian town is still waiting. That brings us to the end of our countdown through 20 of Canada's forgotten ghost towns. From a dismantled coal camp inside Banff National Park to a mining town swallowed whole by a mountain in the span of 2 minutes. From coast to coast, the pattern repeats itself. A resource is found, a town rises fast, and when the ore runs out or the market turns, the wilderness quietly takes it all back. I hope you have enjoyed this video, so make sure to share it with your friends and see you in the next video.